Welcome to the podcast, Anna. I thank you so much for being with us today. And I think this is like such an important conversation because as listeners will find out, we're going to talk about ADHD and neurodiversity as an ADHD coach, but so many more people, and I'm sure women fall into that, are being diagnosed with ADHD. And so I'm so glad to have the opportunity to have this conversation.
Oh, well, thanks for having the platform to do it on. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, I feel blessed to have that as well. So the pleasure is all mine. So before we get into all of the questions, why don't you set the stage for listeners and talk about how you became an entrepreneur? I think it's such an interesting story.
I was always someone who said I would never own my own business. I was a physical therapist for many years, and people would say, "Oh, you should open your own clinic." And I'm like, "Nope, no business sense, zero desire." And then COVID hit, and so all of a sudden, I said, "Okay, I'm going to make my own virtual practice at this
Hmm.
point." And so that is when I just do it kind of reading the way, reading for how do I file for a tax ID and how do I do this? Meanwhile, I had my son in May of 2020. So I had him at the same time that I was launching this business during COVID. I don't recommend doing that all at once. Um, so yeah, I kind of just fell into it. And then as the world started to open up, I decided that I really just wanted to stay in this virtual world. And I really found that I love the psychology of pelvic floor physical therapy. I love the problem solving. I love working with patients and doing and like really empowering them to better their own lives. And it was much less the hands-on. Like I didn't miss the hands-on during
Mm.
COVID. And so that's when I decided, you know what, let's really look into this coaching. And I didn't start off at doing coaching immediately for ADHD. I actually was diagnosed myself with ADHD not long after, I'd say within like the first year after my son was born. I started talking about it, reading about it. And so that's when I took a sharp turn
Hmm.
and have not looked back.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times after more than 140 episodes at the time that this is being recorded, I have heard mom entrepreneur after mom entrepreneur, one start their business like very close to where they have their child or during the pandemic or after the pandemic or what. So I
Yeah.
I am just I'm glad to hear in those difficult moments, we're still able to kind of put ourselves together, pull our bootstraps up, and really put our passion into place and create a business with impact. So you mentioned that you were diagnosed with ADHD, within about a year of having your son. What did that look like? How did that diagnosis come about?
So it was a multi-step process, we'll put it that way. So I I remember meeting with my therapist and we've met virtually every week since, right around when COVID hit. And I remember saying, you know what, with my meds for depression and anxiety and weekly therapy, I am still struggling so much to get through the day. And I just felt like there was this missing piece. And
Mm.
so for me, I actually ended up talking to one of my sisters who was late diagnosed after her son was diagnosed. And in talking to her, and she gave me a book by Sari Solden about women with ADHD, all of these light bulbs just went off. And I went,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, this is my experience. These are the things that I'm struggling
Mhm.
with the most. And
Mhm.
so I, you know, I, we sort of went under the uh, assumption that I probably did have ADHD with
Mhm.
my therapist. But for many reasons,
Mhm.
it took a very long time for me to actually get testing.
Mhm.
And that allowed me to then try a medication that actually worked. I tried one that didn't work. And so it took the actual diagnosis, and the actual testing actually didn't happen until February of 2024.
Hmm.
So, that's several years of not getting that. But eventually I was able to find a provider who would see me in person.
Hmm.
And she did, some tests in her office and said, yeah, you have it. So
Right. So, for anybody listening who may be struggling to get through their day like you did, and maybe, trying to seek an answer for how they're feeling, and with the caveat that ADHD may show up differently for everyone, especially for women, what are some of the symptoms that you were experiencing that to you just you might have thought something's wrong with me, or you were comparing yourself to others, or some of the symptoms that now looking back you're like, oh, I should have, that was definitely a sign that ADHD was happening.
yeah, for me, a lot of it was difficulties with task initiation, like starting the thing. Like I can sit and look around my house at all the things that need to be done, but actually starting the thing
Mm.
was really, really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Also seeing something to completion. And that's
Mm.
also a very classic ADHD trait of like you start and then you lose interest and like you get 90% of it done. And then it's like, oh, we're on to something else. So those two were big things. I think for me, the steps of planning in terms of how to get myself and my son out of the door in the morning, or how to get him to a doctor's appointment, just thinking, having to do all those planning and time management exercises
Mm-hmm.
was tough, and tough in a way that it hadn't been before. um so those are kind of the big things. I also had like incredible, like I've always had like racing thoughts, always.
Mm-hmm.
I never
Mm.
knew that was an ADHD thing.
Mm.
But sometimes I joke and I would ask my husband like, "Hey, what's on your mind?" And he goes, "Nothing." And I'm like, "Literally, because I have like 47 things bouncing in my head right now, and it's all over the place." And so that too, in retrospect, was like, "Oh yeah, no, that was definitely a thing." Because
Mm-hmm.
it's we think of hyperactive ADHD as like a hyperactive can't sit still thing, but often
Mm-hmm.
for women, we
Mm-hmm.
have the inattentive type, and so it's not racing our racing bodies. It's like the hyperactivity in our minds.
Mm-hmm.
And so we look like we totally have it together. And in
Mm-hmm.
our mind, we're just like trying to drown out all of the extra input and noise and thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so interesting. And you also talk about how it can manifest itself, the symptoms, more after childbirth. So can you talk about that? Because I find that so interesting where you think, you may be coping like everybody else with everyday tasks, but something like childbirth can really just be a game changer.
Absolutely. So there are two things I think of with the childbirth. So one is hormone fluctuations exacerbate ADHD symptoms. So a lot of times, puberty, childbirth, perimenopause, menopause, even within a monthly cycle.
Hmm.
Some people are so sensitive that they can sense that. And so sometimes it's the hormonal fluctuation that makes you go from I'm coping, I might not be like loving coping, but I'm doing it, to, oh my gosh, I can't do this anymore, because now there's that piece. But also I've talked to moms who didn't give birth
Mm-hmm.
to their kids,
Mm-hmm.
and the added demand of
Mm-hmm.
having to, we call it executive function. That's kind of the area of the brain that ADHD affects mostly. That when we have to do that for another human, that now pushes us past the threshold of being able to cope. And so all of the strategies that we had been doing don't work anymore.
Yeah, I just think that is just so important to talk about because we so often compare ourselves, especially when we become moms, and you know, and we beat ourselves up And so to find that, okay, there is this thing, whether it is hormonal or, it has a biological source or whatnot, where you shouldn't be beating yourself up. I think that that's just so important. And so, how do you help your clients reclaim, like, not beating themselves up and getting back to, having a sense of control and finding their purpose?
Absolutely. I think, especially with those of us who were not diagnosed until adulthood, we have spent our entire lives beating ourselves up,
Yeah.
thinking there's something wrong with us. Shame, guilt, we're really, really good at that. Um, so I help clients first understand what ADHD is, because I
Mm-hmm.
think it's kind of like you get tested here, you have ADHD, you can try medication, but there's no like instruction manual
Right.
to this is how your brain works. This is
Mhm,
why these things are difficult. And now let's take those things that are difficult and make them friendlier for your brain so
mhm,
that you're not spending your day fighting your
mhm,
brain. You are
mhm,
actually finding ways, and they are very small little things
mhm,
to the small changes make big difference
mhm.
to make things easier. So you have more bandwidth to be
Yeah.
present in your
Mhm,
business, in your home, with the people who mean the most to you. Because
mhm.
it's really easy to get so burned out. Um,
Right.
so I think trying to find those ways to make people successful
Mhm,
in their daily routines can be
mhm.
really, really helpful. And then you start understanding like, oh, I always say like, think about your brain and think about all you did before you were diagnosed. Like
Right.
you did a lot.
Mhm,
And your brain is pretty awesome because you figured
mhm,
out how to do all of that.
mhm,
And so now let's look at our brain with kind of a curious mind and
mhm,
say, all right, now let's take these things that are tricky and find very simple solutions
mhm,
that support you so that you get to your goals
mhm.
happily.
Yeah, I've had experience with family members where a neurodiversity diagnosis can make you look in retrospect to your entire life. And
Yeah,
go,
it's so true.
whoa, wait a minute. So, I know it's going to be different for everyone, but what are some of those common little changes that we can make in our everyday lives that can really make that difference, like you mentioned?
I do simple things like making a lot of decisions at once. So when we talk about meal planning,
Uh-huh.
right? So instead of having to decide every night what to cook for dinner,
Mm-hmm.
now you've decided it just once and then you
Mm-hmm.
just implement it. So even things like choosing your clothes the night before,
Mm-hmm.
one less decision that you have to make in the morning when you're trying to get out the door.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we work a lot on to-do lists because
Mm-hmm.
with ADHD, prioritizing can be really tricky. So working on what's important and what's
Mm-hmm.
urgent and
Mm-hmm.
not kind of losing time on things that don't move the needle. Um, we talk a lot about time management,
Mm-hmm.
how using alarms, using timers, um, using planners or not. Visual schedules can be helpful so that it's right
Mm-hmm.
out there and you don't have to go looking for it because you can just
Mm-hmm.
see what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
um, so little things like that that don't take a lot of overhaul.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's this feeling like, oh my gosh, I have this diagnosis and now everything needs to change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really true. It's just that might need some support in some
Mm-hmm.
small places that will help free up your brain space and your energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fatigue, anybody with children, you're going to experience that regardless. I can't
Right.
imagine, like, if you have, if your brain is wired to be even more fatigued by something like that. I can see where planning ahead like that can really make a difference in conserving your energy and conserving and enabling you, like you said, to increase your capacity in essence, right?
Right. Like I want to have something left when I
Mhm,
leave my work for the day. I also want to have something to bring to my work in the
mhm,
morning. Because
mhm,
if you have kids, sometimes you've already lived an entire lifetime before you
mhm.
sit down at your desk, right? It's like you're
Yeah.
already
for
overstimulated.
3 hours and
Right. Exactly. So I think the idea of kind of managing energy, freeing up your time,
hmm
leaning into how you can best support yourself.
hmm
Um, and that all is so, so important.
hmm One thing that is really important to me is to not create this interview or ask questions from a neurotypical standpoint that makes it seem like ADHD is a weakness. I
Right.
also want to highlight the strengths, and it's so important that we have people like yourself and our listeners who are wired differently. It's so important. And so I would love to talk about what are the strengths of having ADHD and and how can that
Absolutely.
serve someone?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. I think we talk so much about the struggles, but
Right, right.
ADHD, people with ADHD tend to really flock to entrepreneurship.
Mhm.
So we are creative people. We have
Mhm.
great ideas.
Mhm.
We want to do things differently because, if either you see a need in the market or
Mhm.
you need something different for your time and your family.
Mhm.
So we're really flexible thinkers.
Mhm.
Like we're creative. We're really able to pivot quickly.
Mhm.
So if something isn't going right, we try something different, instead
Mhm.
of just kind of being really stuck and rigid to that path that we're already on.
Mhm.
Um, we tend to be very empathetic, really good empaths, and just generally tend to have a lot of energy,
Mhm.
for whether that's hyperactive energy or not, but just
Mhm.
we have all this excitement going on and all this, like, we want to just make the world a better place.
Mhm.
In terms of like being an entrepreneur with ADHD, we want to do
Mhm.
cool things.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. And actually, I just can't believe how many of the thought leaders and online female entrepreneurs have recently come out, like Jenna Kutcher, I think Marie Forleo.
Mhm.
There are so many out there who have come out and said, "Yeah, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and therefore, realizing that it's absolutely not a barrier to thriving as an entrepreneur. I think, probably getting a diagnosis is a key to just learning those little things that you may need to adapt to do things differently, but still absolutely succeed.
Oh yes, for sure. It's definitely not. I mean, there are like severe cases of it where it is disabling, but in general,
Sure.
like, it's we want to succeed. We want our businesses to thrive,
hmm
and knowing how our brain works and where our blind spots are and our strengths are, to knowing
hmm
that helps us to be able to then decide, okay, do we need to farm some stuff out to, a VA or another coworker because we know that that's not our wheelhouse. We know that
hmm
like repetitive tasks are not fun, right? So for
hmm
our brains, because we need this constant stimulation,
hmm
maybe we're really good in the creative idea space, and we
hmm
just need someone to help us with the actually like breaking it down into steps. Here's how we're going to go, and give us that flight path. Because sometimes we have the idea, which is great, but we have zero ideas how to get there, and so we
hmm
just kind of have this paralysis. So
hmm
kind of knowing your strengths, knowing the areas where you're going to kind of teeter a bit, can be
hmm
really, really helpful.
Yeah. And think that the intersection of ADHD and entrepreneurship is so interesting. So I'd love to hear about how you have made entrepreneurship work for you and how it's kind of you found harmony between having ADHD and being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, I know I think for me, like, I know where my blind spots are, in terms of kind of the things that like I'm really good at having ideas, but
hmm
then I kind of fall off the radar. So for me, consistency is tricky. And so I have given myself grace and just saying,
hmm
okay, if I'm not 100% consistent with sending out that blog post every single week, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
probably no one is noticing. Knowing that, I've been able to create my business around my energy and
Mm-hmm.
as well as my son's school has been very helpful. So, as a PT, I would start work as early as my first patient at some point was at 6:40 a.m.
Mm.
And then it would be back to back to back to back to back, lunch break, back to back to back to back to back. And some days I wouldn't leave until 6 or later.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is for me is okay, I know that I'm really good in the mornings after my son leaves. And so that's my time. That's my writing time. That is
Mm-hmm.
my creative time, my idea time. That's where I know that I can get my best focus in and my best work done. And
Mm-hmm.
then saying, okay, I know in the afternoons I'm already tired. What are going to be my low lift tasks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what are the things that I don't need a lot of brain energy to do,
Mm-hmm.
but need to get done? So kind of understanding how to kind of make my days work that way for me has
Mm-hmm.
been very helpful.
Yeah, and maximizing your time. And so I would love to hear how you, in those times when you don't have the most energy, how do you kind of nurture yourself back? How do you take care of yourself to kind of, get that energy again to get back to your schedule?
Exactly. I think for me, frequent little breaks are helpful,
Mm.
so that I don't get totally burned out by the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also kind of take what I call like a nervous system reset
Mm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I just need to lay down, dark room, white noise machine on, not to sleep, but just to kind of let my squirrel brain go and let it run itself out.
Mm.
And then, 15 minutes later, I'm up and I can focus better.
Mm-hmm.
So, and, it's not, again, it's not like I'm taking a nap. It's just like I need all of the input to just stop
Yeah.
for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I can do that, I've got more bandwidth to then keep going.
Mm. That's so interesting. So you find it helpful to, because I think we want to stop our brains from running.
Mhm.
And so when you mentioned giving your brain permission to keep going, you find that helpful?
Yes, because I spend all day trying to stay
Harness that.
focused, right? Trying to harness it in, and it's exhausting, right? And so
Oh,
it
so
just uses
interesting.
so much energy. And so to just being able to just like lay down and just let it run itself out and just not have to try to stay focused, try to stay on task,
Hmm.
all of that is very recharging.
That's just a huge eye opener to me. I find that so interesting. So thank you for like communicating that. And as somebody who's always trying to learn ways, like if I know somebody has ADHD or some other way of thinking, I like to try to have a perspective on what it feels to be them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
So
tricky.
I find that really enlightening. So you're, as you mentioned, you're a mom too. I mean, that's a whole other level of responsibility and in addition to being an entrepreneur. So how do you balance, or there is no balance in my opinion.
Right.
You're always leaning in the direction of what needs your attention at that moment. But are there any additional things that you kind of put in place for yourself that help you not reach that burnout point that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think for me, my son right now, as we're recording this, is 4. And so I try really hard not to be on my phone, not to be on my computer, not doing calls when he's around. And so I try to limit my work hours
Mm-hmm.
to after I drop him off in the morning until he comes home. And then sometimes if I have a little bit of a later call before dinner, that's fine, but I don't open myself up for calls or work after dinner. Like
Mm-hmm.
or on weekends. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think for me, just having that separation, it's like, well, I can't
Mm-hmm.
work if I'm not attached to the internet somehow, right? And so kind of trying to be present, trying to limit those screens can be helpful for me. The other thing too is I have my office space in our basement. And so yes, there's a playroom. If you could see like the train tracks around here, it would be amazing. And the trampoline. But having that separation, like he knows that when I go downstairs, mommy's at work. And
Mm.
then when I'm upstairs, then he can come down here and play and whatnot. So I think having that separation, that physical separation from the rest of the house is
Mhm.
also really helpful.
Yeah, those honestly, those seem really great tips for anybody who is a
Right.
mom and an entrepreneur. And, regardless of, what may be going on with you neurologically, I think that those are really great tips for everyone listening. And so, what advice would you have for moms who are either like thinking that they need to go get testing? I mean, how did you have to specifically know what test to ask for? Maybe are there some things we should look in for healthcare providers that we seek support from? What advice would you give for moms who are looking to maybe get diagnosed or newly diagnosed with ADHD?
Yeah. So if you are suspecting you might have ADHD, start talking to a provider. That can be your PCP, that can be a therapist, that can be your psychiatrist, but start talking to someone about it because someone is going to know how to refer you to where you need to go.
Hmm.
Um, there are different providers that provide different tests. You don't even have to ask for a specific test. You just go, hey, I think I have ADHD. I would really like to get some testing. Where do I go?
Hmm.
Let them help you
Hmm.
because you could do all the research yourself and that's going to take you forever
Hmm.
because we also really like hyper focusing. And so we go down rabbit holes and have zero idea how long we've been down them. So really start talking to someone and asking questions. And if they can't answer them, they're going to tell you who can.
Hmm.
So that's if you think you have it. Um, if you think you have it or you're newly have it, I think finding ADHD friendly communities, strategies, read all you can about it.
Hmm.
Because like I was saying, we don't get that orientation to what is ADHD. And I think there's still, I think, a huge miseducation out there that,
Hmm.
oh, women can't have it,
Hmm. Oh,
um,
yeah. Or all
which is
the
not true.
data is really male specific, for instance. And, some of
Right.
the symptoms that women might have just like fall off the radar. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
20 years ago ish, 25 years ago, um, I was pursuing some sort of testing. And they were basically like, well, just drink coffee before class, you'll be fine. And it's like, this was like around 1999, 2000. And they were like, they basically were like, no, you don't have ADHD, but just drink some coffee before class and you should be fine. Right. And so
Mhm.
even within that 25 years, now
Mhm.
adult women are the biggest slice of the population being
Mhm.
diagnosed
Yeah.
because we're now knowing that, oh, it's not just a little boy's
Mhm.
disorder.
Mhm.
It is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It affects boys and girls, but they just
Yeah.
present very differently. And
Mhm.
so, it was easy to diagnose the boys because they were the
Mhm.
ones, jumping off the walls and interrupting class. But a lot of us don't get diagnosed as women because we have the inattentive subtype, whereas the boys tend to have the hyperactive, impulsive
Mhm.
subtype. And so we're just so different.
Mhm.
So I think really understanding that, yes, you can have ADHD.
Mhm.
Yes, there is help.
Mhm.
Yes, beyond medication, coaching can be
Mhm.
really helpful. Trading ideas with other people with ADHD,
Mhm.
reading books about ADHD, blogs,
Mhm.
podcasts, etc. Really, the more you know,
Mhm.
the more you can understand, and then you can start identifying like, oh, I could really use some support around this.
Yeah.
or that, as opposed to kind of just being like, I don't know, they said I could take medication if I wanted, but
Right.
it's like there's still so much else that you can do.
Mhm. I love that you mentioned that because I think that that's one idea that somebody has when they ever have a diagnosis that might have a medication associated with it is they think, I don't want to take medicine, so forget it. And oftentimes there are lots of other things that you can do. I know you don't really speak on it, but like supplements but like you mentioned, um, you know, just making little small changes in your day can really make a difference. And um what you eat can sometimes contribute to that, but there's so much more information out there. And two, I love that your story emphasizes the fact that be persistent. If somebody is giving you an answer that you're still not comfortable with and is not giving you all of the answering all the questions that you have,
Right.
keep pursuing that. Be your own advocate and educate
Yeah,
yourself. It's something that I've had to do in my life and for my children. And I think as moms, we tend to like really think about that for our children and sometimes not for ourselves as much. But
exactly.
yeah, we
Exactly.
definitely need to do that.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this has been such an important conversation, and I'm sure it's going to land on some ears that needed to hear it today. And so, if you had a takeaway or a few takeaways for listeners today, what would that be?
My top thing is to show yourself compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we are so hard on ourselves. And as women with ADHD, we have spent so long,
Mm-hmm.
thinking that there's something wrong with us
Yeah.
and comparing ourselves to neurotypical world
Mm-hmm.
and feeling like we're always failing and behind. And so kind of understanding if you have ADHD, you have a different toolbox. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a right toolbox or a wrong toolbox. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
different toolbox.
Mm-hmm.
And so showing yourself compassion and grace,
Mm-hmm.
laughing at yourself if you need to. You're like, because,
Right.
I leave keys in the door overnight. So, I'm like, where are my keys? My husband's like, try opening the door. I was like, oh, you're right there. So like some things can just make you laugh. Right. And so
Right.
instead of like beating myself up about it, I
Mm-hmm.
just have to laugh. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think really um, showing yourself compassion and really just being proud of how far you've come,
Mm-hmm.
despite either if you're late diagnosis, not knowing what was going on, or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that you have done amazing things. You're an entrepreneur, you have awesome ideas,
Yeah.
you might be a parent, like you're doing great. And
Mm-hmm.
so give yourself that space
Mm-hmm.
to do it your way.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned too, we didn't get to dive into it too much, but that comparison, it's there for all of us women and all of us moms, especially in a social media driven, society and as entrepreneurs. And so, really creating those benchmarks for yourself, that's a win, is so important. And, if there are moms listening that have kids who are ADHD, have ADHD, or who are not neurotypical, and, what's really tough too is that you don't wear an ADHD badge. You look like everyone else. And so people don't realize the struggles that you have or your children might have. And so make those benchmarks for yourself.
Exactly. Exactly. Just, sometimes it's just like, it doesn't have to be perfect, just get it done.
Yeah,
Right. And so stop
right,
comparing yourself to everybody else
right,
and just do it your way. Check off your own check boxes, make your own
right.
list
Yeah.
and
If
do it your
if you
way.
got up on time every day in a week, that can be a huge success. When,
Yes,
I know other parents struggle, oh, look, my kid got straight A's or whatever. And that's not even in like little things like just getting to school on time can be the biggest win for you, regardless of what grades were earned.
exactly. Exactly. Right.
So,
And yes, right now we're in the phase of if we can get out of the house without a meltdown, we win.
Yeah,
Like, that's just great.
right. Right. And that's just your reality and your story. And so I think creating those benchmarks for yourself are really important.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Anna. I mean, it's such an important topic, and I'm sure that listeners are going to want to connect with you and learn more about your work. So, where can they do that?
Absolutely. My website is annaburnswellness.com. I have free resources there. There's something about meal planning, there's something about sticking and building routines, some time management stuff. It's all free right there. And I'm at Anna Burns Wellness on socials.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Anna. And I'll leave links to that in the show notes below.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Angela. This is great.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Thanks for a great conversation.